Imagine you're sitting by a quiet lake. The air is still, and the surface of the water reflects the golden hues of the setting sun. There's a sense of peace, a deep tranquility that fills the space around you. In these moments, the world seems to pause, and your mind feels calm, like the smooth surface of the lake. But then, unexpectedly, a thought pops into your head. Did I leave the stove on? Suddenly, the stillness is shattered. That peaceful moment is disrupted by an uninvited guest, an errant thought that seems to appear out of nowhere. The calm is gone, replaced by a sense of worry, however fleeting. Have you ever noticed this before? Those thoughts that arise, unbidden, disrupting our peace, they seem to have a life of their own, don't they? But have you ever paused to wonder, where do these thoughts come from? And more importantly, who is the one thinking them? I remember sitting by a similar lake one day, lost in the beauty of nature. As I observed the water, I realized something profound. Just like the water, our thoughts flow continuously, always shifting and changing. They appear, they linger for a moment, then fade into the distance, leaving no trace behind. And yet, I couldn't help but ask myself, who is the one thinking these thoughts? Who is the thinker behind all this mental activity? This question is at the very heart of Buddhist wisdom. The Buddha, as he sat under the Bodhi tree, had a similar realization. He understood that just as the water in the lake is constantly changing, so too are our thoughts. But unlike the water, which can be seen and touched, the mind's flow is more elusive, more mysterious, and the deeper question remains, if you are not your thoughts, then who is thinking them? This question leads us into a journey of self-inquiry, of exploring the nature of the mind, the self, and our thoughts. Buddhism offers profound insights into this very mystery, and by the end of this video, I hope you will begin to understand how you can free yourself from the grip of your thoughts, recognize the true nature of your mind, and find a deeper peace within yourself. Let's dive into this question together. Who is the one that thinks? Chapter 1: The Mystery of Thoughts. Have you ever found yourself deeply immersed in something, perhaps reading a book, solving a problem, or simply enjoying a quiet moment, and then, suddenly, without any effort, a thought emerges from nowhere? Maybe it's a fleeting memory of something long past, or a worry about something that hasn't even happened yet. You weren't trying to think of it, yet there it is, uninvited and disrupting the calm of the moment. Where did this thought come from? Why did it appear so suddenly? Without warning, it almost seems as though the mind is doing its own thing, independent of your awareness. But what if I told you that this phenomenon, these seemingly random thoughts, are not a mental glitch or a sign of something wrong with your mind? Instead, they are the natural state of an untrained mind, a mind that, like a river, is constantly flowing, never stagnant. Buddhism teaches us that thoughts arise and fall away in an endless stream. Much like ripples on the surface of a pond, the flow is constant, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always changing. There's no permanent controller behind this flow of thoughts. It's a continuous process that happens automatically, without any deliberate effort on our part. The Buddha, during his meditation under the Bodhi tree, made an incredible observation. Thoughts come and go, without any permanent thinker behind them. This was a profound insight into the nature of the mind. Imagine the surface of a pond. Every time a pebble is thrown in, a ripple forms and spreads outward. But as soon as the pebble sinks, the ripple disappears. In the same way, our thoughts emerge from the depths of the mind, creating ripples of mental activity, and then fade away, leaving no trace. No one is forcing them to appear. No one is pulling the strings behind the scenes. Thoughts are like these ripples, temporary, transient, and impermanent. The Buddha's teachings on anatta, or the doctrine of no self, take this understanding a step further. According to Buddhism, there is no permanent I, or self, that controls the mind. We often believe that there is a constant, unchanging self behind our thoughts, something that remains the same regardless of what we think or feel. But this belief is an illusion. We mistakenly identify with our thoughts, as though they belong to a fixed I, who is the thinker. But what if the I that we believe controls our thoughts is, in fact, just another passing thought, another ripple in the stream? Take a moment and consider this. When you have a thought, who is having it? Is there really an unchanging you that is controlling every thought? Or is the you identify with just another thought that appears and fades like all the others? Story example. I recall a conversation I had with a close friend who had been practicing mindfulness for several months. When he first began, he was overwhelmed by the constant flow of thoughts that filled his mind. At times, it felt like the thoughts were taking over, like they were unstoppable and uncontrollable. But as he deepened his practice, he started observing these thoughts without judgment. He realized that his thoughts were not him. They were just fleeting mental patterns, arising due to causes and conditions, like waves on the ocean that come and go with the wind. The more he practiced, the more he realized that there was no permanent self that was thinking these thoughts. The idea of an enduring I was simply an illusion, a mental story he had created to make sense of the thoughts. As he became aware of this, he found peace. Instead of being swept away by every thought, he began to observe them with detachment, without identifying with them. This shift in perspective brought him a sense of freedom that he had never experienced before. In Buddhism, this realization is central to understanding the nature of the mind. Once we stop identifying with every thought as my thought, and instead see thoughts for what they are, temporary, impermanent, and without a permanent self, we begin to free ourselves from the mental chatter that so often consumes us. The mind, like a river, may continue to flow, but we no longer feel the need to control it or hold on to every ripple. We become the observer, rather than the one caught in the current. Chapter 2. Searching for the Thinker. Now that we've begun to understand the flow of thoughts, let's dive even deeper. We often believe that behind every thought, there must be a thinker, a permanent, unchanging self that is responsible for controlling our thoughts. This idea is so ingrained in our experience that it seems almost impossible to imagine life without a constant I behind the thoughts. But what if this assumption is wrong? What if there is no permanent thinker at all? Where does that leave us? If there is no unchanging self, no solid I, who is the thinker, what does that say about the nature of our mind? Buddhism offers us a powerful challenge to this deeply held belief. The Buddha's teachings on anatta, the doctrine of no self, invite us to explore the nature of our experience and see if any part of it can be identified as the permanent self. The Buddha observed that everything in life, including our thoughts, is in a constant state of change, and if our thoughts are impermanent, then surely the thinker behind them must also be impermanent. The self, in this view, is not a fixed entity, but a collection of mental and physical processes that arise and pass away, just like the thoughts themselves. Let's try an experiment together. For a moment, close your eyes and search within. Look for the thinker who is supposedly controlling your thoughts. We often feel that there's a fixed, constant I behind the thoughts. But when we look closely, can we actually find it? Take a few moments to examine your mind. Is there a solid, permanent thinker who stands behind all the mental chatter, directing every thought and action? Or is there simply a flow of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, without any permanent self that can be identified as the controller? If you search deeply and carefully, you may come to the same realization the Buddha had: there is no permanent thinker at all. What you find instead is just thoughts themselves, thoughts that arise and pass away, with no fixed I behind them. The thinker is an illusion, a construct that we have come to identify with, but it is not real in the way we imagine. Story example. This insight can be seen in the story of the monk Khimaka, who embarked on a deep investigation into the nature of the self. Khimaka was determined to find the permanent I behind his thoughts and experience. He carefully examined each of the 5 aggregates, the elements that make up the human experience: his body, rupa; feelings, vedana; perceptions, sana; mental formations, sankhara; and consciousness, vijnana. As he investigated each aspect of his experience, he asked himself, is this the self? Is this what makes up the permanent I? After deep contemplation, Khimaka came to a profound realization. Even the thought, I am thinking, was simply another mental formation, just another temporary phenomenon in the mind. It wasn't the thinker, but simply a thought that arose in response to the flow of mental processes. Khimaka realized that there was no permanent, unchanging self behind the thoughts. They were simply natural processes, arising based on causes and conditions, and then fading away when those conditions changed. This realization was liberating for Khimaka. He understood that his thoughts were not his, in the way he had previously believed. There was no permanent I that controlled the thoughts, nor was there an unchanging self that could be identified with any of his experiences. The sense of self, the thinker, was just another passing thought, no different from any other mental formation. Khimaka's insight is a powerful example of the Buddha's teaching. It shows us that the idea of a permanent self is an illusion, and that when we look closely at our thoughts and experiences, we begin to see them for what they truly are: temporary, changing processes, with no fixed self behind them. Dependent origination, pratityasamutpada. The Buddha's teachings on dependent origination, pratityasamutpada, also help explain the nature of our thoughts. According to this law, everything arises due to causes and conditions, just as a seed grows into a plant under the right conditions. Our thoughts arise based on a complex interplay of past experiences, actions, and present circumstances. This means that our thoughts are not the result of a permanent self or a controlling thinker, but instead arise spontaneously, conditioned by the events that have shaped our lives and the present situation we find ourselves in. The thoughts we have today are influenced by our past experiences, the environment we are in, our emotions, and the circumstances of the moment. For example, think about a time when you found yourself remembering an old friend. Perhaps out of the blue. What caused that memory to surface? It wasn't because there was a permanent you controlling your thoughts, but rather because certain conditions, such as a smell, a song, or even an emotion, triggered that memory. The mind, like a river, flows based on conditions, and one thought leads to another in a chain reaction. But there is no permanent self behind this process. It is simply the result of interconnected conditions. The freedom in letting go of the thinker. So, where does this leave us? If there is no permanent thinker, and if our thoughts arise due to causes and conditions, what is left? What we find is a sense of freedom. When we realize that there is no fixed I controlling our thoughts, we begin to see that we are not bound by the flow of thoughts. We are the awareness in which these thoughts arise and pass away. This understanding allows us to let go of the illusion of a permanent self, and to stop clinging to the idea that we are the thinker. When we stop identifying with the thoughts and instead simply observe them as they come and go, we can cultivate a sense of inner peace. We are no longer caught in the cycle of thinking, identifying with every thought that arises. Instead, we become the silent witness, watching the thoughts without judgment, without attachment, and without the need to control them. The search for the thinker ultimately leads us to an extraordinary realization: there is no permanent thinker. What we take to be the self is just another passing thought in the stream of consciousness. This understanding, rooted in the Buddha's teachings, can free us from the illusion of a fixed identity and allow us to experience the flow of life with greater clarity and peace. As you continue your journey of self-inquiry, remember this: there is no permanent self behind your thoughts. There is only the awareness that observes them, and in this awareness, you find your true freedom. Chapter 3: The Clear Awareness Behind Thinking. Beyond the restless stream of thoughts, Beyond the mental chatter that seems to fill every moment, there is something deeper, an awareness that watches, yet remains untouched. This awareness is not just another thought. It is not part of the mental noise that comes and goes. Instead, it is the silent witness, the space in which all thoughts arise and fade away. It is like the vast sky. While thoughts are merely passing clouds, no matter how many clouds move through the sky itself remains unchanged, open, and vast. But here's the challenge. Most of us are so caught up in our thoughts that we fail to notice this awareness. We identify so strongly with the stream of thinking that we never take a step back to recognize the one who is observing the thoughts. We become entangled in every worry, memory, or desire that appears in our minds, forgetting that we are not the thoughts themselves. Have you ever had a moment when, suddenly, everything felt clear? Perhaps it was during a quiet walk, when your mind felt spacious and free, or maybe it was during meditation, or even while simply staring at the ocean. In these moments, the usual mental noise fades, and you sense something deeper, a stillness that exists beyond thinking. That is the awareness we are speaking about. It is always present, but often overlooked. The story of Anuruddha and the power of pure awareness. A powerful story from the time of the Buddha illustrates this concept. Anuruddha, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, was struggling deeply with his meditation practice. No matter how hard he tried to focus, distractions kept pulling him away. He felt frustrated and restless, as if his mind was working against him. Seeing his struggle, the Buddha offered him a simple but profound teaching. He told Anuruddha not to fight his thoughts, not to force them away, but simply to observe them. Be aware of them, the Buddha said, without grasping, without resisting. At first, this seemed difficult. Anuruddha was so used to engaging with every thought that appeared. But as he followed the Buddha's advice, something began to shift. Instead of getting lost in each thought, he simply noticed them. He saw how they arose, lingered for a moment, and then disappeared on their own. He realized that his thoughts were like waves in the ocean, always changing, always moving, but the ocean itself remained. Through this practice, Anuruddha came to a profound realization. He was not his thoughts. He was the awareness that observed them. And the moment he understood this, a deep peace settled within him. The restlessness that had plagued him for so long faded, replaced by a vast, spacious clarity. The science of awareness and the mind. This idea, that we are not our thoughts but the awareness behind them, is not just a Buddhist teaching. Even modern science is beginning to recognize it. Neuroscientists have discovered that the human brain has the ability to observe its own activity, a capacity known as metacognition or self-awareness. This is the very ability that allows us to step back from our thoughts and recognize that we are not controlled by them. Imagine standing outside in the rain. Most of us, when caught in thoughts, are like someone standing in the rain without an umbrella, getting drenched by every worry, every memory, every fear. But what if, instead, we could take a step back, find shelter, and simply watch the rain fall? The rain doesn't stop, but we are no longer affected by it. This is the power of pure awareness. When we recognize that we are not our thoughts, we gain freedom. We are no longer trapped by every passing emotion or belief. The practice of observing thoughts. How do we cultivate this awareness in daily life? The Buddha taught that one of the simplest ways is through mindful observation, the practice of watching thoughts come and go without attaching to them. Try this. For the next few moments, simply close your eyes and watch your mind. Don't try to change anything. Just observe. Notice how thoughts appear, move, and disappear. You may see thoughts about your day, about things you need to do, about the past or future, but instead of engaging with them, just let them pass, like leaves floating down a river. Now, ask yourself, who is watching these thoughts? Is the observer changing, or is it the same still, silent awareness, no matter what thoughts arise? The more we practice this, the more we come to realize that we are not our thoughts. We are the space in which thoughts happen, and in that realization, there is profound freedom. Freedom through awareness. When Anuruddha stopped fighting his thoughts and instead observed them with pure awareness, he found peace, and we, too, can experience that same peace. We do not have to be enslaved by our thoughts. We do not have to react to every worry or fear that arises in the mind. We can simply watch, without attachment, without judgment. This awareness is always present within us. It is not something we need to create, it is something we need to recognize. And once we do, we realize that we are not the chaotic stream of thoughts that constantly flows through our minds. We are the silent witness, the unchanging awareness behind them all. And in that awareness, there is peace. Chapter 4: Mindful Engagement in Daily Life. So, how do we apply this understanding to our everyday lives? We now know that thoughts arise and pass away, and that we are not the thinker, but rather the awareness that observes them. But does this mean we should reject thinking altogether? Should we strive to eliminate all thoughts? The Buddha never taught that we must stop thinking. In fact, thoughts are necessary. They help us plan, learn, and navigate the world. The key is not to suppress them, but to change our relationship with them. Instead of being consumed by our thoughts, we can learn to engage with them mindfully, using them wisely rather than being controlled by them. The story of Angulimala, a shift in perspective. One of the most powerful examples of mindful engagement with thoughts is the story of Angulimala, a man whose life was ruled by destructive thoughts, until he learned to see them for what they were. Angulimala was a notorious criminal, feared by all. His mind was filled with anger, violence, and a sense of vengeance. He lived under the belief that his actions were justified, that he had no choice but to follow the path he was on. His thoughts fueled his actions, leading him deeper into darkness. But then, he encountered the Buddha. Instead of treating Angulimala as a lost cause, the Buddha simply stood in front of him, silent and unmoved. The criminal, expecting fear or resistance, was confused, and in that moment of confusion, something remarkable happened: a pause. The Buddha gently pointed out to Angulimala that he was being led by his own thoughts, blindly reacting rather than consciously choosing. For the first time, Angulimala stopped. He saw his thoughts clearly, without resistance, without justification, and in that clarity, he realized that he didn't have to be a slave to them. He could choose differently. That was the turning point. Angulimala abandoned his old ways and became a monk, dedicating his life to compassion and wisdom. His past didn't disappear, but his relationship with his thoughts changed. He no longer believed he was his thoughts. He saw them as passing formations, and in doing so, he reclaimed his freedom. Applying this in our own lives. Angulimala's transformation may seem extreme, but the same principle applies to us all. Every day, we encounter moments where our thoughts try to take control, when frustration, self-doubt, or anger arise and push us toward reactive behavior. But instead of being dragged along by them, we can pause, just as Angulimala did, and observe our thoughts with clarity. For example, imagine you're struggling with a difficult problem at work. Normally, frustration takes over. I can't do this. I'm not smart enough. This is impossible. These thoughts arise automatically, shaping your emotions and actions. But what if, instead of believing them, you simply noticed them? What if you saw them as just mental formations, temporary ripples in the mind? By stepping back and observing instead of reacting, you create space for insight, for clarity, for solutions to emerge. You don't need to force your thoughts away or suppress them. You simply let them be, without attachment. The power of awareness in action. This simple shift in perspective, seeing thoughts as passing events rather than as absolute truths, can transform how we engage with life. Instead of being trapped by old mental habits, we begin to respond with wisdom rather than react with impulse. The Buddha's teachings remind us, freedom is not about stopping thoughts. It is about no longer being enslaved by them. When we apply this understanding in our daily lives, we discover a new way of being, one rooted in awareness, clarity, and peace. Chapter 5: The Wisdom of Non-Attachment. True freedom comes when we stop clinging to our thoughts. Thoughts are like waves in the ocean. They rise, they fall, they crash, and they dissolve. But just as waves do not define the ocean, our thoughts do not define us. They come and go, but we remain. The Buddha understood this deeply and taught that thoughts are neither good nor bad in themselves. They are simply mental events, arising due to conditions. They can be useful tools, guiding us in making decisions, learning, and growing, but the problem arises when we cling to them, believing that they are absolute truths or that they define who we are. When we identify too strongly with our thoughts, we create suffering. We get stuck in cycles of worry, regret, or craving. But when we learn to observe thoughts without attachment, we create space for peace. The Raft, a lesson in letting go. One of the most famous teachings of the Buddha illustrates this beautifully, the parable of the raft. Imagine you are standing on one side of a river, and the other side represents peace and liberation. To cross, you build a raft and paddle to safety. But once you reach the other shore, would you continue carrying the raft on your shoulders? Or would you leave it behind, recognizing that it has served its purpose? The Buddha explained that thoughts are like this raft. They help us navigate life, but we don't need to carry them with us forever. Clinging to them only burdens us. Similarly, when a thought arises, we can acknowledge it, use it if necessary, but then let it go. We don't need to hold on to every thought that passes through our mind. Freedom through non-attachment. When we stop grasping at our thoughts, we discover a new kind of freedom, one that is spacious, light, and open. We no longer feel trapped by anxieties or fears, because we know that, like waves, they will pass. This is the wisdom of non-attachment, using thoughts without being used by them, holding them lightly, and when the time comes, letting them go. And in this letting go, we find true peace. Throughout this journey, we have explored the nature of thoughts, their impermanence, their spontaneous arising, and the illusion of a permanent thinker behind them. We have seen how, when left unexamined, thoughts can control us, shaping our emotions, decisions, and sense of self. But now, we arrive at the most important realization: you are not your thoughts. The answer to the question, if you are not your thoughts, then who is thinking them, is not found in abstract philosophy, but in direct experience. When you step back and observe your thoughts rather than identifying with them, something shifts. You begin to recognize that there is no fixed self behind the thoughts, only awareness itself. Vast and still, watching without judgment. This awareness is not something you need to create. It has always been there, waiting to be noticed. The path to freedom does not require eliminating thoughts or controlling the mind. Instead, it invites you to see thoughts for what they truly are: temporary, conditioned phenomena. The next time a thought arises, whether joyful, anxious, or troubling, pause, observe it, let it come and let it go. You are not your thoughts. You are the space in which they arise. And in that awareness, you find true peace.